Right, I think I've been given the signal to start, is that correct? Good. So welcome everyone. I'm Rainer Schulze, the Director of the Human Rights Center, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you last end of the academic year and still coming to these events. This evening's lecture marks two separate and yet two very closely related events. On the one hand, this is the beginning of the formal cooperation and collaboration between the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy on the one hand, and the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex on the other. And we are also launching the first joint project, the Human Rights and Drug Policy Debate Series, which is led by the ICHRDP and is based in the School of Law. The International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy was only set up in 2009, but in this short period, it has already developed an excellent reputation for its innovative and cutting-edge work in legal and human rights research and teaching on issues related to drug laws, policy, and enforcement. You will have seen the journal which the ICHRDP is publishing, the only peer-reviewed human rights journal specifically focusing on drug issues. And through its work, the ICHRDP, this doesn't come easily, you need to change that. Supports policy development which reconciles or aims to reconcile the International Narcotics Control Conventions with international human rights law. The Essex Human Rights Center is delighted to be associated with the ICHRDP. I believe we share the same philosophy of linking very closely high-quality research with both teaching and practice. And I can see quite a number of areas where we can develop new initiatives together and where partnership and cooperation will be to the benefit of both of us. This includes basically all areas of our work as far as I can see. I can see us developing joint multidisciplinary research projects which can potentially involve the wide range of academics across the whole of the university who engage in human rights work, not only law, but also sociology, health and human sciences, the Essex Business School, and more. I can also see us including units on human rights, drugs law, drug policy, drug enforcement in our human rights programs here at Essex as essential parts of our various spines in our MA and BA degrees. And I can see us developing CPDs and other training programs for practitioners that we can put on together both here and London and elsewhere. So I would argue the potential for both sides of an emerging partnership, and I hope that we will be able to sign a partnership very shortly, that the potential of such a partnership is immense. And I hope I'm not being too ambitious here, but given time, I think we can actually do something rather quite new and innovative together. The first example of our cooperation is the project that Noam will introduce very briefly in a moment. But before handing over to Noam, let me just say that I regard this project as only the first of many that will follow, the first step in the development of a fruitful and mutually beneficial relationship between the Essex Human Rights Center and the International Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. So I hope this marks the beginning of a long relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and I know what a busy time this is. I do think, hopefully, you'll find this, well, I'm sure you'll find it interesting. I think you'll find it actually relevant to a lot of the things that some of you are preparing for now in your various exams that you're getting ready for. And papers and so on. I just want to say on a personal note that it's actually quite special to see how quickly we got this off the ground, because this all started, this whole idea of a partnership and this project. I think we were 4 of us sitting in a lobby in a hotel in China about, how long was it? When was it, Nancy? Much less, I think. Less than a year, yeah. But yeah, not that long ago when we were thinking this is a great idea to form a partnership with Essex and we can start doing some projects, and we've managed to do that, so that's wonderful. We're actually launching a few things now. There's, as Rainer mentioned, there's the discussions of formal collaboration between the centres. There's also the project. There's also 2 publications, and one of them is the commentary on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child with regard to protection from narcotic drugs. And Damon, I think, your talk's going to be all about that, isn't it? Or a lot about
partly,
that?
Yeah.
Right, okay, so we're going to hear about that, but this is a new publication that's just come out, and we're happy to be launching it here. There's the journal, and I was supposed to take the pointer with me, right?
At the other side of it.
No, yes,
If you point to the right hand arrow, yeah.
that's done them both.
Oh.
Right, anyway, it's supposed to be the journal, because what you're holding now in your hands is the first issue. The second issue has just been launched as well, so this is the first time that, right now in virtual format, but that's being seen, the second issue of this journal. And then there's the project. Now, this project that we're doing, which is housed in the School of Law, is essentially the creation of a series of debates around the world looking at human rights and drug policy. And it'll happen in universities. We're still working on the various places, but discussions are about doing this in Colombia, Indonesia, China, possibly South Africa, as well as sort of the obvious candidates. I think we're talking about doing one at, was it Yale, or I think, but around the world. And the topics that can be discussed, and you'll see this soon, that we're going to debate in these events range, and most people don't realize the wide range here when we talk about human rights and drug policy, but we're talking about mandatory death penalty for drug crimes. We're talking about ill treatment and abuse of drug users in detention. We're talking about wars, armed conflicts. I think Afghanistan, Colombia, the link to violence in Mexico, indigenous rights, Bolivia and coca growers, and obviously a host of issues related to right to health, access to palliative care and certain medicines and so on. So it's endless, really, and it spans almost everything that you'll have looked at in your studies so far this year. There is something there that links to issues of drug policy. And hopefully some of that will be coming out in the lectures you'll see today, but this really is a cutting-edge area of human rights, one in which there are not that many and clearly not enough people working on. And so if you're also still thinking of sort of more areas for various papers and dissertations, there's plenty, and have a chat with Rick or Damon afterwards. They can give you lots of ideas. All right, this is an exciting area, cutting-edge area, and we're going to hear a lot about that from our 2 speakers. So I'll hand over now to Paul, who's going to be chairing. And thanks again for being here.
Good evening, everybody. When I served as rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health, Rick and Damon, our 2 speakers tonight, were extremely supportive and discreetly educated me about some issues that I was unfamiliar with. I say discreetly because I really didn't know much, but they didn't make me feel embarrassed about my ignorance, but educated me, and I'm most grateful to them. And I'm really delighted that we have this new institutional collaboration. And can I very briefly but warmly thank everybody who is responsible for making this collaboration happen. I'm delighted to welcome Rick and Damon and introduce them this evening. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. I suggest we have both presentations and then take Q&A. So briefly, first of all, a word of introduction about Rick. Rick is co-founder of the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy. He's presently, poor man, Executive Director of Harm Reduction International. I say poor man because it's a tough job. It's a demanding job. And he's been working on HIV/AIDS, human rights and drug policy research and advocacy since before the flood, a long time ago, since the early 1990s. And he's very well known for his leading work in areas including HIV in prisons and the death penalty for drug offences. Rick has worked at a senior level for NGOs in Canada, Ireland, the UK, and is a member of the technical advisory group to the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, and also a member of the reference group to the United Nations on HIV and injecting drug use. And the title of Rick's presentation is Deliver Us from Evil, Drug Control, Human Rights and Parallel Universes. Many thanks, Rick.
Thank you. And thanks very much for all the warm welcome. Thank you to Reiner, and thank you to Noam and to Paul, all of whom have been very good friends of Damon and myself in the process of bringing the collaboration between our relatively new project and the Human Rights Center here at Essex. Also Paul, who's been a great friend of ours, as you said, well before Damon and I even founded this project, working together while Paul was the special rapporteur on issues related particularly to HIV and injecting drug use. And thanks to Noam for initially introducing this discussion of the possibility of partnership. And thanks to Nancy Prudhomme, our projects director, for helping to organize today. And especially thanks to all of you for joining us. Paul gave you the topic of my presentation. I'm going to be talking a bit more generally. I'm assuming that most people here are perhaps unfamiliar, would be an understatement, with the nature of international drug control law. So I'm going to try to give a bit of a historical overview and a contextual overview, and then I think Damon is going to take a particular area of drug control and dig down a bit deeper into some of the ways that human rights law engages issues of drug control. Now, see if I can make this work. Now, the man on the left is probably a familiar face. My left, your right, probably a familiar face to most of you. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. My guess is that the man standing next to him is probably less familiar to most of you. Does anyone know who that is? I wouldn't expect that you probably would, unless you were a drug control geek like us. His name is Hamid Ghodzi. He's the president of the International Narcotics Control Board, or the INCB. The International Narcotics Control Board is the treaty body, the United Nations treaty body, which is mandated to oversee the implementation of the 3 United Nations drug control conventions. So it's a parallel committee of independent experts, similar to the Human Rights Committee or the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but it sits specifically within the drug control regime. And just recently, this was in March, the INCB was the subject of a bit of controversy in relationship to this issue of human rights and drug control. One of the members of the board had been in Thailand releasing their annual report and was questioned by a reporter about whether the International Narcotics Control Board had a position on the death penalty for drugs. And the member of the board replied that the INCB had no position on the death penalty for drugs, which was quite unnerving because there actually is quite an established position of the United Nations as an entity, let alone the human rights regime within the United Nations, against the death penalty for drugs specifically, and of course the death penalty generally. Mr. Ghodzi was at a meeting of NGOs in March that Damon attended, There was a question raised about the death penalty. There was also a question raised about the board's annual report in regards to Vietnam. Vietnam is one of several countries in Asia and Southeast Asia that employs a process of mandatorily detaining people for drug use, arbitrary detention. About 50 to 100,000 people are detained specifically in Vietnam for periods of 2 or 3 years at a time. And a lot of the literature and the human rights monitoring of those camps have described them essentially as forced labor camps. The International Narcotics Control Board complimented Vietnam on their drug treatment regime and encouraged them to continue it. So there was a question from one of our NGO colleagues to Mr. Godzi at the NGO meeting, basically asking, in the context of these two issues, the death penalty and the arbitrary detention, is there actually no atrocity horrific enough that the International Narcotics Control Board would take a position on? To which Mr. Godzi replied, 100% no, because we don't actually see it as part of our mandate. We're not mandated to have an opinion. And of course, we're not really talking about matters of opinion here. We're talking about matters of international law. The International Narcotics Control Board is a forum within the regime of international law, but yet they're not really looking at broader international law. And it's quite interesting to us, I think, because when he says they don't express their opinion, they are quite open about expressing other opinions. So while he doesn't want to have an opinion on established areas of human rights law, such as the prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, or the international safeguards on the use of capital punishment, he is quite happy to make up his own human rights. He likes to talk about the right to be free from drug addiction, which is what he talked about in the most recent report of the International Narcotics Control Board. I mean, this is sort of a serious yet, a bit humorous, I suppose, example of where we have this disconnect between human rights and drug policy at the international level. Within the UN system, I suppose the biggest event every year where we see this disconnect is on the date of June 26th. When you look at the United Nations calendar of events every year, June 26th is the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. It's also, ironically, the International Day in the support of victims of torture. So we have this day that's being sort of celebrated or commemorated at the UN for both drug control efforts and a key human rights norm. Of course, the irony here is that China is quite notorious for using June 26th as the day to publicly execute drug offenders. And they tend to execute dozens and dozens of people publicly. And for people who are students of the death penalty or interested in the death penalty, you'll know that China is actually quite secretive about its use of capital punishment. And June 26th is one of the only days of the year when they're not very secretive about it and are quite proud of executing people in their celebration of International Narcotics Control Day. And it's not just China. Indonesia executed some people a couple of years ago as well. So this is an example of what Professor Hunt said in a speech several years ago about this parallel universe, this concept of the United Nations drug control regime and the human rights regime operating as if they exist in parallel universes. We've seen that the drug control regime very rarely looks at issues related to human rights. And on the flip side, the human rights regime within the UN has, until recently, not really been very interested in drug control issues. And between these sort of two stools, or these two parallel universes, to use Professor Hunt's words, we see significant areas of human rights concern. But this isn't actually a new phenomenon within the UN. This kind of idea of parallel universes is as old as the institution itself. Just over 65, 66 years ago, here in London, was the very first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the very first issues that the new UN General Assembly had on their list of items to talk about was what to do about this man. I'm good with pictures today. Anyone recognize him? That's General Francisco Franco, who was the fascist leader of Spain. Franco had led a coup about 10 years prior against the democratically elected government of Spain, with large support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, as well as a number of major US corporations, but that's sort of a different story for the time being, overthrew the democratically elected government and fought on the side of the Axis powers in World War II. After the end of World War II, Franco was really the only one of the major fascist leaders who remained in power. So as this new United Nations, this new international organization came together, one of the first things on the agenda was what to do about the organization's relationship to Spain, because governments didn't actually recognize Franco as a legitimate government. They recognized the Republican government that had been deposed. So the delegation of Panama proposed a resolution to the UN General Assembly, essentially that Franco's Spain be debarred from membership in the United Nations, and specifically banned from participating in any conferences or activities which may be arranged by the United Nations. And when you read the debates and the summary records of that meeting, wonderful speeches from pretty much all of the states represented about the need to not engage with Franco, how we don't recognize the government of Franco. We recognize, the rights of the Republican government that had been deposed. This resolution was passed almost unanimously. There were just a couple of Latin American states who opposed it. I suppose probably states that would have been sympathetic to Franco at the time. That's fine. We can see that's very much in keeping with the founding of the United Nations. 6 months later, in Lake Success, New York, we had the third meeting of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And one of the things on the agenda of that meeting was that they struck a subcommittee to deal with the issue of narcotic drugs. Before the UN was founded, we had the League of Nations. There was half a dozen international drug control treaties agreed under the League of Nations. And one of the first things on the agenda of the Economic and Social Council was how do we bring this body, this existing body of treaty law on drugs, under the umbrella of the United Nations. And so they were debating or drafting a protocol in order to do that. And again, Franco was on the agenda. In this case, there was a resolution put forward jointly by the governments of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and China, basically to say that in the context of drug control, we should not engage with Franco. We should respect the resolution that had been passed 6 months earlier in London at the General Assembly, debarring Franco's Spain from being involved with UN activities. Therefore, we should not collaborate with them on drug control, and we should not invite fascist Spain to be a party to this new protocol that we're discussing. And despite the near unanimous opinion of the General Assembly, we have the parallel universes cropping up. We have the government of the United Kingdom arguing very strenuously against this, that we have to work with Franco when it comes to questions of drug control. Even though Republican Democrats are languishing in prisons in fascist Spain, if you use some of the debates from the General Assembly, we still have to work with Franco around drugs because we can't have Spain become a narco state. I mean, some of the language is very similar to modern language. My home country, Canada, also opposed this resolution. In the end, the resolution that the UN should not collaborate with Franco's Spain on drug control did pass. The UK was the only government that voted against it. 5 countries abstained, including Canada and Greece and France and Colombia, one other, I can't remember. But again, we get back to Professor Hunt's comments that we have governments in one body of the UN talking about human rights that speak in a certain language, and as soon as they move over and get into the forum talking about drugs, they talk a very different language. And I say this dates from the very foundation of the institution itself. So we move to the modern day, the United Nations drug control system. This is the United Nations headquarters in Vienna. Many of you may not know that there's a UN headquarters in Vienna. People are familiar with the one in New York, where the General Assembly with. You'd be familiar with the one in Geneva, where the human rights bodies sit, the World Health Organization sits. This is the one in Vienna, which is where the drug control regime sits, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency. In addition to the International Narcotics Control Board, which I mentioned, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is based in Vienna, which many of you have probably heard of, and also the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. The international drug control regime is underpinned in the modern era by 3 international conventions negotiated through the United Nations system. These conventions enjoy almost universal ratification at this point in time. The first one was agreed in 1961, and this was essentially the convention that brought together all of the existing League of Nations conventions under that, primarily dealing with plant-based narcotics, focusing primarily on cannabis, coca, and opium. In 1971, Convention on Psychotropic Substances, again extending international control to more, laboratory-based drugs. And the 1988 Convention, which expands and further codifies penal sanctions related to drug control. As I mentioned, the International Narcotics Control Board, which oversees these three treaties as the treaty body. We also have the political body, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which meets in Vienna. I think it has 52, 53 member states. This is the old room that they used to meet in. I like this picture. That person there, that's actually me speaking. You'll see the seat I'm sitting in is actually the designated NGO seat at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We get one seat, and it's very near the door. Actually, if you move two seats to my right, you're actually basically in the toilets. So that's where the NGOs sit. And I like this picture because you'll notice if you're actually important in this meeting, you sit up there because that's actually where everyone's facing. So you have your little NGOs, and we share seats if we get the opportunity to speak, which isn't very often, to make a representation to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Within the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they have a separate meeting, which is called the Committee of the Whole, which is essentially where they negotiate line by line the resolutions that come before the committee. And this is a separate room. And in 2008, it was an interesting time, and Damon was part of this. A very leading member of the UK delegation at that point in time, where the very first human rights resolution ever proposed came for debate before the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it caused all kinds of controversy. Not to pick on the Chinese delegation, but they had some of the best lines. Again, to talk about these parallel universes or this disconnect, China argued that discussion of political issues such as human rights are inappropriate at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's not appropriate to address human rights within the mission of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it's ridiculous to require us to work in accordance with human rights law. That's China there. And that's Damon. You can't really see him arguing against China. The resolution passed in a watered-down form. It was actually quite significant, even though the language itself was weakened. When we go to the language of the convention itself, I think we can see where some of this disconnect continues even within the legal instruments. This is from the preamble to the 1961 convention. And we see that the primary objective of the treaty supposedly is to be concerned with the health and welfare of mankind, and talks about the need to provide narcotic drugs for pain relief and for scientific and medical purposes. And for those of us who do human rights, I think we can be very comfortable with this kind of language. This is very much falls within the conception of the right to the highest attainable standard of health. The general comment on Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights talks specifically about one of the obligations within Article 12, the right to health, is the provision of medicines, for example. So I think for human rights people like ourselves, this is something we can be very comfortable with, this kind of conception of drug control. But of course, this more humanitarian instinct is sort of immediately undercut by the subsequent lines in the preamble, which talks about addiction to narcotic drugs constituting a serious evil for the individual and being fraught with significant danger to mankind, and it's the responsibility of states to combat this evil. And I remember when I was doing research on this, I was really perplexed because the term evil isn't something you really see in legal instruments. You know, we talk about evil, that's like a philosophical concept or a theological concept that we talk about. You don't really talk about evil within legal terms. So it got me thinking about other international instruments that were drafted to control or suppress or prohibit other kinds of behaviors or social institutions or social or political systems which the international community finds abhorrent. So, for example, the Convention Against Slavery in 1926 doesn't describe slavery as evil. The Genocide Convention doesn't describe genocide as evil. The Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't describe nuclear holocaust as evil. The Apartheid Convention doesn't describe apartheid as evil, and the Torture Convention doesn't describe torture as evil. Yet somehow drug addiction within international law is evil, an evil that must be combated through universal coordinated action amongst states. The language, as we get past 1961, gets even a bit more, dramatic. This is from the Political Declaration on Drugs in 1988. Drugs are a grave threat to the health and well-being of all mankind, the independence of states, democracy, the stability of nations, the structure of all societies, and the dignity and hope of millions of people and their families. And this is very much the kind of language you see today in instruments around terrorism. And I think there is a parallel when we're talking about human rights protections in one war, the war on drugs versus the war on terror. I think there's a lot of work that is available to be done by people doing human rights to look at some of the parallels in the approach to those. And I guess just to close off then, we have to start thinking in human rights terms is what are actually the human rights consequences of defining drugs and drug addiction as an evil that needs to be combated through coordinated universal action. And just to touch on a few very quickly, there's many. The death penalty is one that we've already mentioned earlier on. I say Ricky would know this sign much better than us. The death penalty for drug offenses. I say the issue that the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion on. Well, the UN human rights system has very strong opinions on this. The Human Rights Committee has said explicitly that drug crimes do not meet the threshold of most serious crimes under Article 6.2 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime is, in this point in time, spoken out against the death penalty for drugs, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Quite unanimous opinion amongst the United Nations generally on the death penalty and specifically the death penalty for drugs. Despite that, about 32 countries and territories have the death penalty for drugs in legislation, and we estimate that perhaps up to 1,000 people a year are executed for drug offenses. So it's actually, in terms of overall executions internationally, drug offenses represent a significant number of people who are executed. Arbitrary detention, the other issue I mentioned at the beginning. In quite a number of countries, particularly in Asia and South Asia, we have forms of arbitrary detention, detention without trial, administrative detention, under the guise of drug treatment. And these are, people can be detained for months or even up to years at a time in conditions which have been very well documented now in many countries amount to forced labor, if not inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, beatings, overcrowded prison conditions, lack of access to medical treatment, humiliating treatment, caning. About 350,000 people in arbitrary detention of this kind in China, in drug detention, say Vietnam, Thailand, India, Russia, some other countries. Ironically, the very week that Hamid Godzi said that the International Narcotics Control Board didn't have a position on this, 12 UN agencies came out collectively with a statement condemning drug detention, sort of a fairly unprecedented statement by 12 separate agencies of the UN, yet the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion. Again, related not only to drug detention centers, but something our colleague Eka Yakobashvili, alumni here of the Essex Human Rights Center, has done sort of the leading work on, is the issue of corporal punishment for drug offenses, which we see in at least a dozen countries that we've documented it in: caning, flogging, whipping for drug use or relapsing from drug addiction or from drug treatment. Again, very clearly a form of inhuman and degrading punishment, which is fairly universally condemned by human rights monitors. And just very quickly, again, it's already been mentioned, the right to health. We have about 15 million people that we know inject drugs worldwide, a very major behavior in the spread of HIV epidemics in many parts of the world. Yet in many parts of the world, people are denied the access to the prevention of, or access to measures to prevent HIV, such as sterile injecting equipment, such as methadone programs. Very much putting those people at additional and preventable risk of HIV infection and increased overdose in many countries as well. That's something we can talk about more specifically, and something that Professor Hunt did quite a lot of work on during his time as special rapporteur. And so I opened with two people, one you recognize and one you didn't, probably the same here. You probably, although reversed, you probably recognize the person on your left, the Pope. The person on your right you probably don't recognize. That's Yuri Fedotov, the newish head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, a career Russian diplomat, former Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom, who is unfortunately bringing a very reactionary tenor to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime at the moment, particularly when it comes to rights of health issues of people who use drugs. Also when it comes to issues that Noam mentioned of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime's position on Afghanistan. Of course, Russia is very much fighting with Afghanistan in the international arena because Russia blames its drug problems on Afghanistan. And just a nice quote from Tvetan Todorov, the philosopher, talking about the context of delivering us from evil. The idea that it implies that there is an evil element in human nature from which God can free us, and we'll pray that he'll free us as beings. And we know human beings have sometimes been tempted to take upon this purifying role ourselves, and we're very well aware of the catastrophic consequences. So thank you very much.
Of the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy, also Deputy Director at Harm Reduction International. He's very well known internationally for his work on the human rights dimensions of drug policies as researcher, advocate, thinker. And he's the author of the first commentary on Article 33 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the only core UN human rights treaty to refer to drugs. And this is going to be the subject of his talk. Thanks very much, Damon.
Thanks very much, Paul. I promise this wasn't planned, but I'm pretty much going to follow almost exactly Rick's trajectory in his talk, and I'm going to drill it down into the rights of the child, if possible, except without evil. I'm talking about something a little bit more positive. I'm asking the question about appropriate measures for quite a good reason, and I think you'll see it. We've been doing seminars, myself and Rick, at universities for the last few years as part of this project. And the first one we did was in Galway at the Irish Centre for Human Rights. And myself and Rick were sitting in a hotel, and we wondered how we were going to do it. And we realized the best way to do it is just ask the audience to name any human right, any single human right you like, and we'll be able to connect it to drug policy pretty quickly. One particular smart arse said, well, the right to not be imprisoned for non-payment of a debt. And I was like, that's just not fair. You can't prove us wrong. But what I can do, what it showed was two things. The first is that drug policy is sweeping, but the second is that the human rights framework is more than up to the challenge. Now the thing is, over time I've realized that you can name any child right, and I can connect it to drug policy in the same way. Now part of that is because the Convention on the Rights of the Child is quite comprehensive, and the other is because the impacts of drug control and drug policies and drug use and dependence on children is so sweeping. And I'm going to try and deal with some of that now. So this picture follows a raid on a favela in Brazil in 2009. I think it was on a day when 19 people were killed. And the first time I looked at it, the reason I looked at it was about where your eye is drawn. And it's drawn to the bloody mess to the center left. What you miss is the blurry child in the foreground, I think, often, which is looking directly at you, almost asking to be noticed. And I found that across the board, really, in drug control and in children's rights, the issue of children and drugs coming together hasn't necessarily been noticed. You got the Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1959, talking about mankind owing to the child the best it has to give. And in drug control, similar rhetoric comes through. What you often find is that, and this happens at the UN level, you've got the Political Declaration on Drugs there from 2009. That was the 10-year review, by the way, of the declaration Rick mentioned, talking about children as our future and youth as our most precious asset. Therefore, what we do is in their name, as well as democracies and the well-being of our entire society and all the rest of the stuff that Rick mentioned. You see this at national level too, and you see it to justify some pretty unusual things. I might talk about that a little later, but children are at the foreground of justifications for drug control. And I think that's right. I can't think of a better justification. But the question is whether what's actually been done delivers on that promise or not, or if it's been positive or negative for children's rights and well-being. coming in the middle of those two declarations that I mentioned, of course, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, smack in the middle was the first time drugs appeared in the negotiations, and it was introduced by China. It looks very different now. This is the actual wording from what it did then. At the time, it was about preventing and prohibiting children from using drugs, but the Netherlands quite, I think, helpfully pointed out that this is a children's rights convention, and talking about prevention, preventing things or prohibitions within it, it doesn't fit. So a more of a protection approach was taken. It's a 50-word article, right? So and it's, read on its own, if you take a rather literal approach to that, it's not going to tell you much at all. It simply says that you take all appropriate measures to protect children from drugs and don't let them get used in the drug trade either, which is singularly unhelpful, in fact, except that it brings those parallel universes we talked about straight together, at least for children and young people within this convention. So the question of what it means, I think, is quite important, because children's rights have not really been much of a subject in drugs when it comes to drug policies. Article 33 in the academia, if you search for it, doesn't really appear, and if it does, my name's probably now next to it, sadly. And there's a couple of notable articles, but not many. In the UN drug control regime, it pops up every so often, but it's rare and it's usually unhelpful. It will either be equating it with prevention, so education in schools and just stopping children using drugs, which is part of it but not the entirety. It doesn't lead you anywhere. There are resolutions at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs on Children, and they will frame everything around Article 33, but then they just talk about what we call primary prevention. And at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you've got some very helpful recommendations. You've got general comment on HIV/AIDS, which has some very good normative guidance in it. You've got the general comment on adolescent health, which is good. You've got some concluding observations that are excellent, particularly in more recent years. I would invite anybody to read the one on Ukraine from 2011. Then you've got some that are very general and quite vague. They just restate Article 33 and move on. And then you've got some that are really quite unhelpful. They tend to talk about combating drug addiction the same way as the Drug Convention does. And a particular example where, at the time, I think it was 2002, the Philippines were asked to enforce their drug control legislation in order to protect children, which was a real example of the committee's ignorance of the context, because at the time the Philippines had the death penalty for drugs. They've now abolished it for all crimes, but at the time that's what the Committee on the Rights of the Child was telling the Philippines to do in the name of children's rights. In the actual conventions themselves, I think this is an example of the parallel universes too, and the reason to drill down. You've got these singular mentions. Drugs appears once in the core human rights treaties, happens to be the CRC. It does appear in the International Labour Organization Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labour, pops up in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, a kind of mixed up wording of Article 33 that makes it considerably worse, I think. And it comes up in some other regional documents. Human rights appears only once in those 3 drug conventions that Rick mentioned, which is unusual given that there's over 110 articles collectively. Given that they cover issues like extradition and penalties, it appears only once, and it's in the context of crop eradication in the 1988 Trafficking Convention. And then the interesting thing for me is I did a search for children and minors and youth and any such wording, and they similarly appear only once each. Children appears in the preamble to the 1988 convention, in that the threat to children is a danger of, quote, incalculable gravity. And minors appear also in the same convention under the penal provisions, saying that if you use minors in trafficking or if you sell drugs near a sports or educational ground, these are the particularly serious crimes. So there's the official connections drawn. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are more connections, but it needs a lot more work that hasn't quite been done, which is what this book was about, I believe. Yeah, there we go. So I did this with my colleague Philip Veerman, who's now a psychologist working with young people who use drugs in the Netherlands, but he formerly was at Defence for Children International, so he's got a good crossover there. And that Nancy has a copy of this book if anyone wants to read it. To buy it yourself, it's quite expensive, but there is one here in Nancy's office if anyone wants to have a look. Okay, now we've stopped my slides. The project actually expanded something way beyond what I thought it was going to be. When I started drilling into those 50 words in the actual article, I'm not going to talk about everything that we covered because we dealt with everything from drug use among children to production side stuff, which is why we went way beyond the word count the publishers wanted. I'm going to just focus on the 2 words that are in my title, which is appropriate measures. The reason I do that is because it frames the rest of it. I think you've got an important qualifier there and something you can build a legal test around, which I'll get to towards the end. Because without that qualifier, the rest of it can be used to justify just about anything, as I think Rick alluded to. The question is what measures are appropriate to protect children from drugs and to prevent their use in the drug trade. There are any number of other questions to be raised in here, and the study that I've done is really a conversation starter. It doesn't deal with any of this comprehensively or definitively. Issues like what's the connection between the relevant international treaties and the Convention on the Rights of the Child? At the time, they were really just talking about the 61 and 71 drugs treaties, but since then, you've got the 88 trafficking one. You've got the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which I think changes the dynamic significantly. I talk about that a bit in this book, but I think there's a lot more work to be done, especially given the fact that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control explicitly connects itself to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So let's look at the issue of parents. I've chosen some rather egregious examples here to illustrate the point. On the top right of the picture, that is a protest about the execution of Sally Ordinario Villanueva last year. She was a mother of 3 from the Philippines who was executed in China for drug offenses. The woman on the top left, coincidentally, is also from the Philippines, and she's in a Brazilian prison for drug trafficking. She did that out of poverty, no other options, but she's a mother of 5. And even when she finishes her sentence, she won't be able to afford the ticket to go home. This is the issue of drug mules, of course, that everyone's probably heard of. And on the top right, Rick already mentioned the death penalty. I would invite everybody, by the way, it's just come out. The Quakers UN office has just done a great little booklet on children of parents on death row and children of parents who've been executed. It's an issue I really haven't seen people taking up enough. And on the bottom, I don't know, has anyone heard of Project Prevention? Have you ever heard of this? So Project Prevention has been going since the 90s in the United States and offers drug users $200-300 to be sterilized or to undergo long-term contraception. The reason being, the woman who runs this, and this is a quote, she says that, or a paraphrase, but it's next to a quote, that, we spay and neuter dogs, so, these women are dropping babies like litters, so we need to do something about it. Now, she's adopted 4 children herself from a woman who was using crack. But there are many ethical and human rights, and I think child rights issues with this. So the question for me is, how do you take into account the best interests of the child and children's rights when sentencing primary caregivers or mothers in particular? Given that in that same prison where that woman on the top left is, there are many children, because there's nowhere else to go except into prison with your mother. Similarly, around questions around sentencing in terms of the death penalty. And the question on the bottom is just an egregious example of the very sensitive issue of parents who are drug dependent. What is an appropriate measure to deal with that? Because there's no doubt that there's significant risk to children around alcohol and drug dependency related to parenting, no doubt. The question is, what's an appropriate thing to do about it? And trying to prevent those children from ever being born seems like a massive waste of time and a seriously ethical minefield you're getting yourself into. There are many other things that can be done there. There's drug liaison midwives for people who are using drugs and they're pregnant. There are opioid substitution programs to try and stabilize people and to make them a little bit safer than using street-bought heroin and so on. There's any number of things that can be done. Focused social work, there's an excellent pilot program that's been going on in Wales for some time. This brings us to the question of appropriate measures. What about schools? On the left there, I'm sorry to say that's me published in the Daily Mail, but someone had published a commentary calling for sniffer dogs and random drug testing in schools. And I just thought, even a right-wing paper will understand that you don't want your children being randomly tested and pulled into the criminal justice system and the treatment system and being branded a drug user just because they might have tried a joint. I don't think even the most cautious of parents wants that for their child. But random school drug testing, I might talk about again later on. When I talk about evidence and the concept in law that we all know of arbitrariness. Because not only is there no evidence to support this, in fact, the evidence suggests it doesn't work. There isn't even a workable theory as to why it might possibly work to help kids or to stop other kids using. No one's ever set that out. Someone just thought this is a great idea, I think I'll try it. What you will do is increase truancy and decrease trust between your students and the teachers, which actually does decrease drug use and early pregnancies. On the right is an armed school raid in the United States. We could talk about other things, strip searching of children as parts of drug raids. If anyone studies US law, maybe the Savannah Redding case might pop to mind, where a girl was strip searched because someone told a teacher she was carrying ibuprofen, which of course is just a headache pill. So coming back to Rick's point about the International Narcotics Control Board, I'm going to talk about some different issues, but Rick mentioned this as a parallel treaty body between the drug control and human rights regime. I thought I'd compare what they've said to some of the things the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said on the same topics, right? So here we have Mexico. On the left, you've got a peace march. On the right, you've got an orphaned child. You can do a search on Google if you want for any number of gory images from Mexico. I thought I'd save us all that. The top is one of a number of either unqualified or supportive statements the INCB has made for what Mexico has done. Now, I've been in meetings with Mexican politicians, and at this point, you can only sympathize with the situation they're in. This is. I think everybody recognizes that launching tens of thousands of troops to fight the cartels was an enormous and catastrophic mistake, but how you reverse it is very, very difficult. But you would expect, perhaps at least, the treaty body for the drug conventions, which of course is the justification for doing this in the first place, to possibly say, look, we recognize there was a problem there. No, instead we get this being referred to as decisive measures to address the drug problems. The year previously, they called it the Mexican government's tremendous efforts. And they do mention the body count, but they don't say anything bad about it. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, in its review of the optional protocol on children in armed conflict, was very concerned about this because at least 1,000 children have been killed at this point in this. And children under the age of 18 have been used to fight the cartels as part of the military, which the Committee on the Rights of the Child was also not impressed with. The man on the right is Professor Hunt's successor as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. That's Anand Grover. And on the left is a picture from a Vietnam drug detention center. Now, this is the quote that Rick was talking about when the INCB supported Vietnam. This did follow, by the way, the INCB's mission to Vietnam. They went there and saw this and came back and still had nothing to say. The committee has addressed the same topic in relation to Cambodia in 2010, and they recognized that this was arbitrary detention of children and abuse of children, and that these centers should be closed down and the children released. The INCB has yet to take a position, as Rick mentioned. And this, as you might recognize, is an airplane spraying glyphosate, or what the Monsanto would call Roundup, its chemical, on coca fields in Colombia. Here's the INCB urging the government of Colombia and others, but Colombia is the only place where this happens at the moment anywhere in the world, to step up its measures. So without any criticism of aerial fumigation, which has, by the way, contributed to human displacement, it does contribute to health concerns when you connect the chemical that we're talking about here with the other chemicals necessary to attach it to plants, the surfactants they call them. It has had health concerns. In fact, Professor Hunt was in Ecuador, I believe, in 2007, and I'm not sure if that report has yet been published about that visit. Ecuador is now suing Colombia at the International Court of Justice about this. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2006 criticized Colombia for it and said that they should conduct a child rights impact assessment of it. Recently, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has said something similar. UN Development Programme has also criticized this. We could also mention the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights as well, who's also been against it. The INCB asks, without commentary, that this be stepped up. So it leads me to getting past the kind of the problems and what I wanted to do in the book was to if it says appropriate measures in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, then what would we mean by it? The phrase props up elsewhere in the context of violence against children or child abuse and neglect. Similar wording, take all appropriate measures to protect children. But of course, violence against children and drugs are qualitatively different things. Children using drugs, for example, is a category of risk or vulnerability for those children. Violence against children is a direct abuse against them. So while the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said in their recent general comment that appropriate measures in the context of Article 19 can't be read to justify any form of violence against children, can you say the same thing in relation to under 18s who use drugs? Could you say that? And what if your measures lead to violence and a violation of Article 19 in the first place? So I think the words might mean different things in Article 19 than what they mean in Article 33. So looking at it in a normative context, this is what I came up with, at least to start off the debate. The first is that whatever measure you take should be read in the light of the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a whole. You can't take this thing out of context. I think that's standard reading of an international treaty. Secondly, I think you need to take into account other laws, and this is brought in by Article 41 of the Convention, unless I'm making a horrible mistake, more conducive to the realization of the rights of the child. Now that's really interesting. I had Brazil at the start. Now Brazil's got great national legislation on children's rights. It doesn't necessarily translate into that on the ground. It also brings in the question of using other international human rights instruments, such as the Convention Against Torture, for example, against drug detention centres. But it raises the question, are the drug conventions more conducive to the realization of the rights of the child in this context than the convention itself? Given that children barely arise in the context of the drug conventions, I don't think so. I think the child rights framework has more to say if you can drill down. I suggest that we need to focus on vulnerability or patterns of vulnerability, including socioeconomic status, and in particular gender. There's a lot to that. Around the way girls in particular start using drugs, the connections between sex work and very problematic drug use and so on, and in relation to parenting. I would suggest, and this comes from our public health background, that your measures should be evidence-based. You don't want to undertake arbitrary measures that are just somebody's idea of what might work. Brings me back to that random school drug testing idea. Arbitrariness, I think, is something that's quite common to legal standards. I think we all know it. And my final one is that sometimes things are evidence-based but not necessarily appropriate or proportionate anyway. You can guarantee that somebody won't reoffend if you kill them. It's not a proportionate response. It's not an appropriate response. It's not a child rights-based response. So this is where I was starting from with that idea of what would be an appropriate measure. Now the thing is that could be a little bit vague still. I mean, I think a legitimate criticism of international human rights treaties is that they're a little bit nebulous to apply to very acute problems on the ground. So let's take one. This is where I said I'd follow Rick's trajectory. I'm going to end on a very similar picture to his, except these are children in Odessa a few years ago. After these pictures were taken, they disappeared. Nobody knows where any of them are. They're injecting a homemade drug. They basically call it Baltushka. It means it's a form of stimulant, but it's whatever they can get their hands on, really. A lot of them live in the sewers. They live in burnt-out buses. They live in the streets. There's tens of thousands of street children across Ukraine. The actual number isn't known. But what we do know is that the vast majority of boys under the age of 25 contract HIV through injecting drug use. Girls less so, but the connection between drug use and sex work among girls in the streets and elsewhere in Ukraine is stark. So, what's an appropriate measure to protect those children? Because at the moment what you'll have is, and this happens in other countries, it's a serious problem in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a serious problem in East Asia and South Asia. And there's very little in the way of guidelines around it, there's very little in the way of disaggregated data to even know the concept. And here we're getting into reading this in the context of the convention as a whole, because if we look at let's start with that. Let's start with the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an easy way to get in. We've got non-discrimination, which requires disaggregated data in order to uncover those patterns of vulnerability that I talked about. Here, we don't know how many under 18s are doing this. We don't know their situation. We know very little about them. So there's a data collection imperative to study this and find out what's going on. We can look at something like, in other countries where this happens, it happens in the UK, right? In many countries, when you do have something where you can intervene in the immediacy of that risky activity, needle and syringe programs, right? It's very controversial to hand a clean needle to a child. And many countries will simply put an age restriction to not have to deal with that problem. In Sweden, the age is 20. In other countries, it's more around the age of majority, about 18. But the fact is that the age of initiation into the practice is often below that. So what you've got is a gap in protection. Now, the thing is, you can try and work with those children over time to try and get them off drugs, but you have to look at that in context. If you're street involved, no education, sometimes no parents and so on, this is a rational course of action for that kind of life. So, what does the Convention on the Rights of the Child say about an age restriction like that on those services? Let's look at that in the context of the best interests of the child. If you need to make a best interest assessment, you need to have some leeway for what to do. If you put an age restriction in the middle of the legislation, you've made an arbitrary decision from policymakers that's implemented on top of clinicians and service providers with no opportunity for the young person to have a voice. Article 12, the other general principle that I wanted to talk about. It doesn't take into account the child's evolving capacities, Article 5, such that a very young child might be responded to very differently from a 17-year-old, for example. And we can look at this in a more of a holistic way, right? There's one of the things that Professor Hunt said and that Noam said was the amount of different human rights that are touched upon, the amount of different issues that are touched upon. And to finish, I'll give an example from Ireland, where I'm from. A study was done in 2008 that looked at 86 under-19s using opiates. And they studied the various life situations of these young people upon entry into treatment. And what they found was, among many other issues around their health status, people newly testing positive for hepatitis C and HIV and so on, they found that 44 of them had previous psychiatric contact. They'd been in touch with mental health services. Very few of them were living with their main families. Some of them had been homeless. Many of them had been in contact with the criminal justice system. And they were engaging many, many, many rights of the child and a protective framework around the issue. One of the things that really struck me was education. Of the 86, although the vast majority were of school age, because it's 18 and under in Ireland, only 5 were currently in school. And see, the thing is that the initial reaction there is, well, of course, if you're going to be using drugs, you're probably going to eventually find yourself outside of school. But over half of those initiated drug use after they left school, and in particular, being excluded from school, was a very risky factor. It was the one that really denoted whether children might possibly get into risky behaviours. It's actually something that's mirrored in HIV prevention. If you can keep kids in school, you can protect them. Brings me back to random school drug testing again, which has been shown to increase truancy. So what I've tried to do from here is to show that children are at the forefront of measures, justifications for drug control. Some of the issues that affect children, some of the vague mentions of children in the international system, the lack of any concrete work that's been done on it, and the scale of the work that still needs to be done, because this is just one issue on one street and one sewer in Odessa. And context is everything, because this is dealt with here in the UK in a very different way, and it can be dealt with in a very different way here in the UK because of that context. So there we have any number of theses just from what I've tried to say today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Damon. Thank you. And we now have some minutes for questions, discussion, comments. Who would like to start? We have a microphone here.
Just for recording purposes. If you were going to put the session on our website, if you do not wish to be on the website, just come and tell me afterwards, and we'll just not put the clip or the question.
Please, sir.
No, you can say something.
I'm Michel Mabo from Health and Human Sciences, first year PhD student. And I'm very happy to have listened to both presentations. But I'm a novice when it comes to this whole issue about drugs and human rights. But I have an experience which I want to share here. Back in Cameroon, I teach students in health and allied health professions. And this academic year, I had a peculiar problem. For the first time, I had students in one of my classes who were smoking cannabis. It was an issue that we were aware of, but I was also aware that I couldn't expel these students from school based on that problem. And again, I was acutely aware that we had no structures to help this kind of students. I spoke with two of the students, and I found that I was not equipped to solve that problem. And so when I sat down and listened to these presentations, this issue came back to mind, because the question I asked myself is, if people are taking drugs, something pushes them to it. And what is that particular thing that pushes them to it? If we can find those problems, then maybe there will be other solutions to that than one of the things that was presented here as the death sentence or the death penalty. Now I ask the first question here, that what do governments do, what do societies do, and what do individuals in society do to prevent the use of drugs or the proliferation of drugs? Because I think that if a government has a right to take life because somebody trafficked or is involved in trafficking of drugs, that right should only come when the government has done everything possible to ensure that possible or predisposing factors to drug use and drug proliferation have been eliminated. So if a government or a society has not done that, I wonder why they should have the right to use the death penalty as one of the strategies to discourage the proliferation of drugs. Then the second observation from one of the conventions, I'm sorry I didn't get the particular one, but I have some words there. States should take all appropriate measures, including legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures, and it continues. Now, I think that maybe this wording or the wordings of this convention could be revisited if possible, because when you say take all appropriate measures, the convention doesn't describe or define appropriate measures. And that may be why some governments will implement some very drastic and controversial strategies to fight drugs. Maybe if this kind of convention, the wordings in this convention were revisited, we could have a broader base for governments to avoid using those kind of strategies these presentations have tried to draw our attention to. Thank you.
Michelle, thanks very much. I don't know if you would like to, there were sort of two main points. Shall I leave it to you to decide who responds to them? The second one is really yours, I think. Yeah.
So, what I've done here, there's a section in here where I pull apart every clause in that. That's from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's Article 33. And what I do in this book here is to take all those clauses and try and pull them apart. And it's all open to debate because, like I said, this is a conversation starter. And I've taken a very broad reading of it. Some people might try and go more literal, but I've gone more kind of dynamic interpretation on it. I will say one thing about legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures. Look what's missing, right? It says including, so it's not exhaustive. But what's de-emphasized? Military and criminal. They're not in there. Nobody said launch a war on drugs in this thing. Nobody said send the cops out after the kids. The thing about, I'll leave Rick maybe to the death penalty, although it's connected. The thing about helping the students, the evidence suggests that expulsion's a really bad idea. That's the first way to go. And what drives young people to use drugs? I mean, don't put your hands up, but just there's loads of people in this room who've used them. Just what drove you to do it? It's probably fun, boredom for the vast majority of people. The vast majority of young people who start will stop eventually. What sometimes you might call regression to the mean. People just transition out of it. The people who become problematic users, there's other stuff going on in their lives, but the serious majority of people aren't. And the problem is we've designed a system where we treat everybody as if they're problematic. And that disallows us to target people because we've taken a blunt, criminal law focus that drives people away from ever wanting to put up their hand, like I just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I would come back to the drug conventions as well. I mean, I put up that part from the preamble, the opening lines of the preamble to the 1961 drug convention, talking about, being concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. It's the first line in the convention. And I think you could argue a very good case that, and actually when you read the history of the drafting of drug treaties, even going back to the League of Nations treaties, drug control is very often typically described in humanitarian terms. So there is this kind of ethos going back, and it's reflected in a bit of that preamble, that the reason we control drugs is because we want to help people and make people better. But as Damon says, I think what's happened is whatever instinct there might have been around that kind of humanitarian ethos and that health promoting, right to health kind of ethos that we see reflected in that language gets significantly undermined when, as I said in the second part of that preamble, when we start to talk about drug addiction as something that's evil, or we start to talk about drugs as threats to democracy, security of the state, and this kind of language is very, sort of over-the-top kind of language that almost justifies almost any kind of extreme response, and also, I would think, makes it almost imperative upon states that if you're not taking this kind of extreme response, then somehow, as you said, you're being lax in your response. And I think we see that in the work of the International Narcotics Control Board. If Colombia is not spraying poisons out of the back of planes over coca fields and everything else it drifts over, then you're not actually, sort of fighting the war on drugs. And this is where it becomes problematic, because on the ground, and Damon's pictures, I think, showed this much better than mine, what you're talking about around drug use is individual behaviors and individual people from a variety of circumstances with a variety of vulnerabilities who engage in that behavior. And some people get into problems with that, health problems, social problems, economic problems, criminal justice problems. The vast majority don't. So I think Damon put it very nicely, is what we have is a system that's designed for one particular kind of extreme, which gets exacerbated over everything. And unfortunately, sort of the human rights elements of that get overwhelmed by this sort of fear. And that's why I sort of mentioned, I showed that quote from the '88 political declaration on drugs, because I think that language is so similar to some of the declarations or the rhetoric we see around the war on terror. And interestingly, when the war on terror was declared in 2001, immediately we saw the human rights community, we saw the European Union, we saw other UN agencies immediately recognizing the risk to human rights coming from this language and talking about human rights constraints within fighting the war on terror. And we have declarations on human rights in combating terrorism. We don't have that in the context of fighting the war on drugs, which so many countries see themselves as fighting, even though in many ways the conception of what's at risk from that sort of rhetorical structure is the same. And that's where I think we sort of get these very egregious kinds of criminal justice responses or policy responses that make people more vulnerable.
Thank you both. Other hands, please.
Thank you. My name is Diana, PhD student, and probably this question is for you. From the point of view of a producer country like Colombia, for example, many people in the civil society have said that the only way to stop the very bad results of the traffic of drugs, like, in terms of violence, militarization, aerial sprays, funding of illegal groups in the armed conflict, is actually by legalizing the consumption and the production of drugs. What is, I think, is more interesting is during the last government of the President Santos, he was very open to these kind of proposals, and he actually said that he will be able to consider these kind of ideas if the international community will support him. So my question is, do you think that it would be possible that once the international community would really take seriously these kind of ideas?
Well, I know Damon will have a lot to say on this too. I mean, I think what's actually interesting in terms of international relations at the moment is you're actually starting to see that debate open up, and it's being very much driven by Latin American countries, presidents, and just we've had a couple of meetings just recently, in Cartagena and some other things, where we've had presidents of Central American and South American countries, primarily for security reasons, coming out and sort of saying that this sort of very militarized approach to the war on drugs is actually, not doing the things that 88 political declaration says about, securing the viability of the state and ensuring democracy, but in fact it's undermining those things by militarizing the situation and in many cases empowering the sort of criminal cartels. So I think what's interesting at the moment is we're sort of having this debate opened up at a very high level in a number of countries, presidents of countries sort of coming out and talking about these things. So in terms of debates and discussions around alternative sort of rubrics to how to deal with drugs away from strict prohibition, and whether that's sort of legalization or regulation or control or decriminalization, which we have, of use, and which is another debate. In Portugal we have forms of decriminalization, some other countries. It's actually an interesting time because we do see a debate opening up sort of beyond the kind of NGO level and actually moving up more into people with political power. Of course, there's very strong reactions against that from states that have a very strong entrenched interest in maintaining the war on drugs.
Yeah, with Colombia, I mean, I've heard that before, that we want to see something change, but we're not going to do it unless it's all of the governments of the world coming together. It's never going to happen. You're never going to get all of the governments eventually deciding to change this, because the Russians aren't going to move, the Chinese aren't going to move, and the Iranians aren't going to move, and so on. And if you're looking for consensus on it, it's not going to happen. In fact, it seems to me that one of the problems has been that somehow you need consensus, as if this is a global singular problem and not a whole selection of cultural and regional and security and human rights problems that are trying to be pulled under one rather restrictive umbrella. If regional bodies like OAS or any other regional entities want to move, I think they're going to have to do it on their own and basically develop the international argument. The problem is that what goes on behind the scenes is just before the Cartagena summit, the people pushing for that was Guatemala. And just before it, of course, you had the vice president and other senior US officials flying down there and saying, this isn't going to work. So, I mean, the other question that comes up is about the drug conventions. It's the connected thing. In order to actually do that, you have to undo the 3 conventions that Rick talked about. And one of the issues that comes up is what do you replace them with from an international legal perspective. Now, if you take, and I agree broadly that you should, if you take the drug trade out of the hands of criminal gangsters, it's inevitably going to gravitate towards business. So then any business and human rights people should start looking into this. Now, it's going to happen eventually, I think, but it's going to be a long way off. It'd be good to see the research being done now on the risks of corporations getting their hands on some of the commodities that criminals currently have. But as for the other thing that a diplomat told me recently was, I don't want to get into a treaty negotiation with some countries these days. It's not 1952, it's not 1960s. I don't want to be renegotiating this with them now. I'd rather try and work within the current international legal framework, because it could get worse.
Thank you. I think, did you have your hand up?
It was basically a similar question to the legalization thing. Is there any indication whether it's viable? Because I thought of the same topic, because in some countries they've made this move with prostitution, where they've legalized prostitution to the extent so that the state can actually fulfill its human rights obligations by controlling. But is it actually, are there any indications that it's viable, that there could be state control or state regulation?
Right. Well, I mean, no one's tried it for a long time. Bear in mind that the current system we have has been a developing international experiment over the last 100 years. It's not exactly something that historically existed. In that time, it seems that things have gotten worse. But There's very few examples that people can go on. One of them is Portugal, where across the board drugs are decriminalized. It doesn't mean it's legal, but it's criminal sanctions aren't applied. And the best you can say from that, it's ups and downs, like all policy, right? It's not broad, it's not entirely successful or unsuccessful. What you can see is that the sky didn't fall in. And you do see rates among some demographics going up a little bit, usually older people. Related to my topic, rates of drug use among the 15 to 19-year-old age group, which is the one you might want to be most concerned about, came down. HIV rates came down, prison rates came down, and so on. But it did connect at the time with a lot more spending on social and health issues. And this is one of the issues that, again, it comes back to about actually sex work too. So you have somewhere like New Zealand where you can put in a regulated model quite well because of the infrastructure. It actually connects to the issue I talked about with the children in Odessa too, versus, say, someone doing the same thing in the UK. You know, how do you take the same market, even in sex work, and regulate that in sub-Saharan Africa in a mining town with nothing connected to it? You know what I mean? There's a real issue of infrastructure there, and the same goes for drugs. One of the arguments against legalization that comes out, although I think it's false, is you're expecting development countries to put in health safety nets for the aftermath. The flip side, of course, is, well, we're already expecting them to put in criminal justice instruments for what's going on now. It's all going to cost money. It all depends on how you're going to spend it. But and either way, people should be putting in health systems right now. I'm sure Professor Hunt would agree. Is it viable? I mean, at the point is at the moment that the debate's opening up about whether it should be. What's good from a human rights perspective is to come at it from outside of the drug policy sphere, where that's often a loggerheads argument, and just to look at it less, or not dispassionately, because it's hard to do that, but look at it with less of a less prejudice as to where you come from. Just look at it from a human rights perspective and see what you come up with.
I think a lot of these questions within the context of the Human Rights Center at Essex, and one of the reasons I think we're quite excited to be associated with the Human Rights Center here, is these kind of questions point up the ways in which a lot of these human rights and drugs issues can be dealt with in a manner that's interdisciplinary. I mean, we've obviously talked a lot about international law and international legal instruments, but even the questions in the discussion, we're getting into issues of health policy, we're getting into issues of development, we're getting into issues of, you know, other areas of criminal justice or gender equality issues or children's rights issues. So, I mean, when we get into issues of drug policy and human rights, there's lots of different approaches you can bring into it, and you should bring into it to actually come up with policies and solutions that are going to be effective, because there are ways, as you said, you can measure in a lot of ways. If you're looking at a health policy related to drugs, in a lot of cases, you can measure the health impacts of a particular criminal justice approach, and, you know, bring that into good policy making or good lawmaking. So I think in terms of, you know, our interest, the interdisciplinary nature of the Human Rights Center here lends itself very well to sort of discussing these issues in the round and looking at human rights from a variety of different perspectives.
Thanks, Rick. Any final questions? We've been... Jo Young, please.
Hello, yeah, I'm Ji Young. Thank you very much, both of you, for good presentations. And my question is, maybe it can be a bit broad, but my question is, can you tell us some good state practice which can be considered to be close to human rights-based approach to drug policy and law? It's very broad, so maybe you can give us some examples, maybe focusing only on children, drug policies, and human rights, for instance. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mean, in terms of the issues of, I mean, what our other job is working on issues related primarily to health issues for people who use drugs. And there's lots of good examples internationally of health policy frameworks or legal frameworks that are more health promoting for people who actually use drugs, particularly people who inject drugs. Because one of the things we find in terms of increasing the risk for people of contracting HIV or hepatitis C, risks of overdose, risks of incarceration, which therefore increase other kinds of health risk. We can see very clearly where punitive approaches, you know, mandatory sentencing, we see that in the United States quite a lot, or legal frameworks that actually legally prohibit proven scientifically proven medical interventions. And so in our sector, we talk a lot about Russia and the fact that Russia criminalizes methadone, which is a medicine that you can take as a substitution to heroin. So you don't actually have to inject heroin. You can get your methadone prescription from your doctor. Very many countries of the world have in place public health policies that would provide essential medical services and HIV prevention services and overdose prevention services to people who use drugs to decrease their vulnerability and actually recognize their right to the highest attainable standard of health, recognizing that a person who uses drugs or a person who injects drugs, they live their life in a specific context, they have specific health vulnerabilities because of that behavior. And rather than just criminalize them, we're going to actually engage them as recipients of health services and put in place sort of non-judgmental services that meet their needs as drug users. And lots of good examples like that around the world, in whether or not Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, Australia, certain parts of North America, where there's large issues around injecting drug use and HIV. On the flip side of that, we can see the bad examples that happen when you criminalize those populations very harshly, because what happens is you essentially deny them access to those medical services on the one hand, which means that rates of overdose or HIV will go up. You also drive them away from medical services. So people go underground. You have the sort of situations where Damon was showing you of homelessness, of marginalization, of going in and out of prison, which has all other kinds of vulnerabilities, both short-term and long-term. So when we come to health policies, and I say Professor Hunt did work on this when he was Special Rapporteur, there are very good examples of national or even local legislative and policy frameworks that would promote the right to health of people who use drugs.
Yeah, I mean, the list of good and bad examples, I think, is fairly long. I mean, when it comes to children and young people, the first thing to do, it seems, is to at least allow yourself the possibility that a lot of the drug use happening is non-problematic, and that it's a phase of development and it's a phase of adolescence, and for the vast majority it's going to be a transitional thing, and that seems to be the case. But there are, particularly young children, if they're using drugs, you're already in a spot of bother, so you've got to intervene in some manner. Older adolescents, you need to look for patterns of vulnerability, things that are adding to that. One of the things that you find in drug policy as you move forward is that a lot of the best things that you can do have very little to do with drug interventions at all. So everyone wants to educate kids out of starting, and people want to try and treat people who are dependent and so on, which of course we should try and do. But I'll give you a country which is an example of good and bad practice at the exact same time. It's Sweden, right? So Sweden has pretty low rates of drug use generally among children and young people. It's got pretty low rates of problematic drug use in the adult population too, generally. It's got very little to do with Sweden's drug policies. It's got more to do with Sweden's general culture of temperance over many decades. A very strong social contract, high rates of tax that people are very happy to pay, strong health systems, low income inequality, excellent schools, and so on and so on and so on. Really strong social safety nets across the board. And then you get to their drug policy, which is quite bad, because Sweden has decided that they'll have a restrictive drug policy. So what you do is you have all those social safety nets which can't catch everybody, and in denying what we all refer to as harm reduction programs, generally, there's some, but it's not scaled up enough, people fall through the gaps. In fact, one of Professor Hunt's recommendations after his mission to Sweden in 2007 was to scale these things up for HIV prevention. Because in a country like Sweden, 30% of your new HIV infections should not be through injecting drug use, and that's what it currently is. And those are the infections that happen in Sweden. Because still there's only 2 needle and syringe programs in the country. And this is where the gaps are happening. And the age restriction on that is 20, even though the age of initiation into injecting drug use in the country on average is 17. These are the gaps. So there's good and bad things you can do at the exact same time.
Let me take one final question, if there is one. We should begin to wrap up soon, because we've been using a lot of the time of Rick and Damon. A question?
It's regarding the war against drugs. I wonder if you think that there could be, if it's possible to design or to apply some kind of harm reduction approach to the overall strategy against drugs. At least while it is not possible to stop the war because the prohibitionist system is ongoing. So I don't know if there's a way to reduce the harm that is causing now. That is the question.
Okay. Can I speak to that one for a second?
Sure.
Right, so
Sorry.
I better explain to people. Harm reduction isn't something that people might be familiar with because it just sounds like any two words thrown together about less harm, right? So it's a bit nebulous in that way. In the public health field, harm reduction refers to policies and interventions designed to reduce the social and health consequences associated with drug use, right? And the most kind of well-known examples are needle and syringe programs, so you're not injecting with sterile equipment, or methadone for opiate users, right? These are some of the most basic examples. There's more. This question has come up recently about can you apply the harm reduction paradigm to production and supply issues? And and I invite you to do it, to read the International Journal of Drug Policy. There's an ongoing debate on this. So a couple of economists applied this to production in Latin America, and said that a harm reduction paradigm should be applied to this instead of just blanket trying to eradicate all the crops. I wrote a response against that. And it's not because I'm against the idea, I'm just against applying what's already a difficult term to sell. It's doubly negative, harm and reduction. You're not looking at anything positive, and you're not preventing or eliminating anything. You're just reducing a bunch of harm, right? So, but also what I actually wanted to get at was two things. First, harm reduction is strong because the evidence base for it in public health is so strong. And if you start diffusing that, anything is harm reduction. The Chinese can say executing people is reducing harm because it's one less trafficker on the streets, right? The Colombians can say spraying the crops is reducing harm because there's less drugs in the streets elsewhere. So you need to keep the definition tight. It doesn't mean you don't do those policies, but it just becomes good policy. What I tried to say was harm reduction is becoming increasingly recognized as a strong component of the right to health and other human rights, and there are strong international human rights arguments as to why you need to improve things at producer and supply level as well. In other words, these are all components of a human rights-based approach to the problem.
Rick, would you like to?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. Well, I think I should draw the meeting to a close. And on your behalf, thank Rick and Damon for brilliant presentations, rich, accessible, engaging, interdisciplinary too. And I enjoyed the way that you dipped into history, Franco, League of Nations. You dipped into the importance of being aware of where you're sitting at a meeting. This is very important. The contextualization of words like evil, the discussion of the legal meaning of phrases like appropriate measures. Importantly, the importance of data collection, of evidence, and there was much, much more. And it's been, in my view, this evening, a wonderful example of the consistent application of human rights into a really important domain and into a really new domain, relatively new domain. And carrying human rights into new territories is hard work. There's always resistance. You need clarity of thought, consistency of principle, an ability to build conceptual bridges, an ability to build new political alliances. And it seems to me that you have both managed to do all those things as advocates and activists, researchers, thinkers, authors, even diplomats. So I don't wish to embarrass you, but you've done a fantastic job and have really blazed a trail for others to follow, including myself. So I'm extremely grateful to you for the role that you've played, and many thanks for educating us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks very much. It's very kind of you.
How's the baby?
2 babies now.
knew there was I knew there was a second one.
Oh, that's what you're talking about then. Yeah, he's all right. He's a bit snuffly, so he's awake most of the night, but he's all right.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. It was great. It's great. It's really good.
I better take this. They charge 100 quid for it. I'm not letting it go. And they only gave me 2.
Hello.
Sorry, what was
They only gave me 2.
Oh, is that right?
Stingy. Ah, you're damn right. Yeah, put my name on there. But the baby's grand. You know, it's.
Thank you very much.
It cuts into my work time. My ability to travel is significantly curtailed. I mean, it's travel, divorce. It's a pretty easy choice, you know.
Okay.
West Norwood in South London. Hold on.
I hope that the presence of the BBC signals that he will now sign.